Okay, well, I think I am going to start. We have a very tight schedule, and also I don't want too much kind of uncomfortable dead air. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Seeing Sound 2020. I'd love to be able to say it's great to see you all, and of course I can't, which feels very strange. I am actually sitting here at Bath Spa University in a completely empty room with loads of empty seats in front of me. And the whole university is empty, apart from I've seen 3 dog walkers. So it's very, very strange. But I know you're there, and it's really nice to be able to talk to you and really nice to bring you together. Seeing Sound kind of feels like a bit of an extended family to me who get together every 2 years. And I really hope that I will get a chance to interact with you in one way or another over the course of the weekend, whether it's on a little chat, in a Q&A, or whatever. So yes, 2020 has been a insert expletive here for pretty much all of us, really, and we're kind of at the end of it now. The purpose of this Seeing Sound is not to dwell on the past and to, commiserate on what a terrible time we've all had, though we might do a bit of that. But rather to look forward and to try and find a little bit of hope. I don't know about any of you, but I am actually feeling a little bit hopeful here at the end of the year, a little bit. None of this is down to our politicians, certainly here in the UK. Some of it's down to vaccines, but mostly it's down to people I know and the sort of people who are here right now at Seeing Sound. I've been really happy to see, and it sort of snuck up on me, that people are upping their game, I think, after that initial shell shock period in the first half of the year. I've noticed people taking stock, finding new ways of doing things, and actually making some remarkable work. I've seen some great things coming out this year, despite all the odds, and some of it's been made by people in this room. So that's what we're going to look at in Seeing Sound 2020, is new ways of doing things. I hope that next year things will be a bit more like they were, and we'll be able to do public events, concerts, and so on. But it will be different, as we all know, and we'll have to continue to find new ways of doing things. And I think we've learned things from this year that we can take forward, and that's going to be the theme, certainly, of these panels. So I'm not going to spend too much time introducing the whole event now, because we have a lot to get through in this panel itself. The one thing I would normally do now is read out a list of thanks, and there are indeed lots of thanks. I will save those until the end of the event. I'm chairing the last panel as well, and I'll make sure to include those then. But for now, you know who you are. And thank you to everybody, really. Anyway, so this first panel is called New Forms. And this panel is really about ways of breaking boundaries. All of the people that I've invited to be on this panel, or I should say we've invited, are breaking out of their little boxes. That seems quite a nice metaphor in this format, whether it's in terms of genre or venues or ways of doing things. I'm not going to spend too long introducing our panelists, because they're going to do little introductions themselves. But it's fantastic to see you all, Sophia, Marcel, Tadej, and Thor. Sophia I've known for a really long time, and been following your career with great interest. You're on your 4th album now, is that right, Sophia?
Well, 3rd album, there was an EP as well.
Right.
Quite close.
But yeah, you've really been developing what you do, and what I have found interesting about it right the way through is the way you kind of break through genres, really. You won't know this, but one of my MA students is actually writing a dissertation on you and various other artists around Bristol at the moment. And he literally, I had a tutorial with him yesterday, he can't work out what to call it, because it's completely, really new in terms of genre. And right across, sort of art music, not art music, obviously that doesn't mean anything anymore. But really, yeah, breaking new ground in those terms. I also feel that you've sort of broken format with your new album, Untold, and I'm really interested in the way that it's been released in across many different formats. So sound, AV, a book, and they all seem to really work together in a way that I think is kind of quite new. Marcel and Tadej, sorry to sort of lump you together for a minute. I don't know if this will work, but what I find really interesting in both of your work in terms of AV is that you almost seem to break away from the screen and the idea of flat 2D video, and really to work with light as your medium in quite a lot of your work in a real kind of three-dimensional and physical way that I find very exciting. I think you both also kind of break genre, perhaps. Tadej, I think your background is really like mine in sort of electroacoustic music, but you seem to have kind of really moved away from that in lots of different ways. And Marcel, you're very much associated with the Atonal event in Berlin, which I was very lucky to go to last year. And I found that really interesting as a genre-breaking event as well. For me, in a sort of perhaps a slightly old fart perspective, it was kind of experimental music, but in a huge club setting with people dancing. And I found that a really amazing experience. Thor is a professor of future music, no less. So you've got the perfect job title for this panel. But Thor, I invited you here particularly because, again, you find new ways of working, particularly in the field of live coding, where really the act of creating a tool and the act of creating music are one and the same, and you make your software in the course of a performance. And recently you've also been very involved in AI, and we have the first paper this afternoon, the first presentation by Thor and various colleagues is on that work, which is very exciting. I also really recommend Thor's book to you, Sonic Writing, which I found a really great sort of new philosophical framework for music and technology, really. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to hand over to Sophia for a minute. Sophia, if you'd mind just saying a few words to introduce yourself.
No worries. So as you mentioned, I work across a variety of disciplines, but my background is predominantly in sound. I'm currently signed to Houndstooth Records, who have just released my multidisciplinary work Untold. And this work comprises of a series of audio compositions, a book of sonic fictions in poetic form, an AV and a media work. Across these disciplines, I use fictioning as a method of exploring post-anthropocentric ecologies and as a way of thinking about possible future environments. My new audiovisual show, Tellurian Visions, is a collaboration with a visual artist from Sweden, Annie Tadney, and it combines processed aerial drone footage of multiple locations that I visited in Iceland, and recontextualizes them to sort of visualize the sound environment's presence within the LP Untold. It's also a response to my poetic collection, a Tellurian Memorandum, which I haven't done anything of, but here's the book. And I'll just sort of flick through, but there's lots of lovely photos that are stills from the show in there. So I think we've got a link lined up to play that will just introduce the audio-visual practice. So I think Erin's going to do that.
Erin, are you able to play that?
Yeah, just 2 moments.
Just she's appearing there very quickly. Erin is our producer for this show and she's doing an amazing job. I will thank you properly at the end, but just while you're there, I just wanted to point out who you are.
That's my 30 seconds.
You've been trying to hide, but you didn't manage for a minute there.
Thank you.
Hey, that's beautiful, Sophia. Fantastic.
It was lagging slightly, but I think that might be the streaming.
Yeah, we'll get a bit of that, I'm afraid.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah, thank you. So next, I'm just doing these in the order they appear on the website for no particular reason. There's no real structure to this, but next I'd like to turn to Marcel, who I think has some stuff to show us and a few things to say.
Yes, hi. Yes, I would also say I'm happy to be invited to this one, and I'm happy to see you all here, even though I don't see anyone.
Yeah.
I'm an audiovisual artist. I think that's maybe what connects all of us in this group. I'm also working quite interdisciplinary. I've always been interested in this idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, of really orchestrating all senses. And my expertise is more in the field of lights, visuals, stage design. So in that sense, to play with the whole visual appearance and feeling of a space, and to combine that with musicians. Usually I work with musicians. And in later days also with theater directors, choreographers, and so on. Yes, I am indeed, I think, a bit known for my work for Atonal. So I will show a few slides how that looks. So move out of the way. So this is one of the lighting designs I did in that space to really combine the impressive architecture that the venue has with something that is met in the lighting, that the lighting really extends the space and builds an architecture of light that is completely encompassing you as a visitor and really creates an atmosphere that already absorbs you before you reach the stage or any exhibition piece. So that was one of the ideas, to already extend this, or to already invite someone into an atmosphere and extend the feeling of the festival before hitting a floor or an actual presentation. This is one more. This is during a concert. This is the same from Upside Down. So I was working a lot in the scope of this festival. I'm working in between the aesthetic or the artistic and the technical side. And for this one, worked a lot with like mobile trussing to really compress the space at times, make it feel claustrophobic and really closed, and then open it again and make it wide and big and open and yeah, something to breathe and feel. I'm working a lot with atmosphere and haze, so a lot of gloomy lights in a lot of my works, because that creates some of the special moments that I love. And this, I guess, is another example for yeah, this idea of architecture of light, to really develop a three-dimensional space that encompasses everyone, audience as well as artist on stage. Here's another one that's more a dreamy atmosphere. So I'm also working with colors, not to create an impression of only working with black and white. I'm also practicing more and more in the field of how you say, body performance. So last year at Atonal, I did a piece called Nervous System 2020. It's a collaboration with the three dancers. This is Maria, Carles, and Angèle. And it's done together with Guillaume Marie, the performer and a choreographer from Paris. And this piece is about this piece is a reflection basically on modern day data-driven society. It's dealing with all the tropes of isolation that we especially know in these times of a pandemic, sitting only in front of a screen, but that already were like as writings on the wall beforehand. And I tried to, we tried to compress all these thoughts and ideas into the shape of 3 boxes that were staged in the space. You could walk around, explore these boxes, and in these boxes were the isolated performers, and they were enveloped by holographic projections. So this is what we see. This light is really going all around them, and they are interfering and interacting with the light, and it amplifies their emotions that they perform. It's a tool of interaction, basically. And there's a few pictures of this performance. And in the show, there's a lot of ideas of like of finding telemetric spirituality, being the best of yourself, of gaming. Basically, gaming is a big topic these days, right? And Decotora, of K-pop. There's a lot of also like psychological tropes like neurosis, overstimulation, claustrophobia, and all of these notions that I guess a lot of us touch these days while being in the pandemic and being in shutdown were eerily, prophetically already foreshadowed in this piece. Yes, last one. Aside these big collaborations, I'm also touring with musicians, so I'm taking care of their stage design, lighting, and so on. And this one here is Ben Frost performing in, I think this is in Spain, Gijón Festival. And I designed to show that is starting on the screen, but then extending into space. So again, the idea of entangling all senses, of being physical at times and of retreating to a screen, being more narrative, being more concrete at times, being more abstract at others. This is another one. And there's of course a lot of visuals on the screen which take a lot of the tropes in the music in this album, in the conceptual realm, which is like radiant cosmic force, like sitting in a particle blaster. This was the feeling of it that we were going for. And I tried to rebuild these in abstract imagery, which were at times on the screen, at times not visible, and at times it turned into, again, these beams of light that completely mesmerize and take you on a journey. And always should go well with the music to form something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. Well, there's another piece, second last one, that I also did at Atonal, presented at Atonal. This was with Roddy Porter, British composer as well, and filmed in Iceland, as Iceland seemed to be the conjunction of this talk. This was about the extension of senses, or like the limits of perception. Essentially, was trying to imagine how it is if we perceive the world as we do increasingly through devices and gadgets, what that means to our mind and to our perception of the world. And was trying to create at first like barren landscapes, very infinite. Like I was always shooting landscapes that looked infinite, shooting them in Iceland, and then enhancing them by all types of visual distortions inspired by all types of defects, basically mental defects. And at the end of the show, this culminated in a point where like there were 10 strobes on the stage, and I just played like super high, super bright, super high frequency visual pattern on these strobes. Like the pattern were all in the realm of milliseconds, like the phase shifting in between, brightness shifting, etc. And I asked the audience to close their eyes, so at the final point of this performance, you have an experience that only happens to you yourself, because with closed eyes, of course, the room disappears and you are alone. You're in this crowd, you're in there with everyone together, with everyone, but at the same time, you have this very unique personal experience. So working in this visual arts kind of sense with light is also, I think, one of the big or important points of my practice. Last but not least, I also want to mention a piece I did 2 years ago with Liz Harris. She's also known as Grouper. And this was filmed in Murmansk, a city at the outskirts of the world, in the very north of Russia, beyond the Arctic Circle. And it's basically just a visit, an audiovisual visit to that space that is so different from all the other places that we usually travel to, that we usually know. That is very beautiful in some ways and very decaying, broken in other ways. And in this performance, it was my first and only one, I think, where I got rid of all the visual garment, all the effects are gone. It's completely concrete, and I was only playing with time and rhythm, brightness, lightness, all these tropes of classic cinema in a way, and combining them with the music and trying to create a true impression of Murmansk. Yep, that was it. I think that wraps up.
Thank you.
All the aspects.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And yeah, I really enjoyed seeing some of that work at Atonal last year. The piece with the performers, yeah, I absolutely see what you mean about that kind of claustrophobic thing, maybe pre-shadowing lockdown. The dancers were kind of in fish tanks, weren't they, and really kind of enclosed in that.
Exactly, it's like transparent boxes, and it was eerie.
Really nice to see themes emerging. They always do with Seeing Sound, and already we have a bit of an Iceland thing going on. Of course, Thor is in Iceland. I haven't really mentioned where people are yet. Marcel is in Berlin. Thor is in Iceland. But yeah, next I'd like to turn to Tadej. I think we've got a short film to play for Tadej. Do you want to do that first, Tadej? Or yeah. Okay, back over to you, Erin, if you could roll the film.
My name is Tadej Drolc. I'm an artist and creative coder, and I work at the intersection of sound, image and light. For me, the essence of audiovisual art are audiovisual relationships, and that is what I would like to talk about today. I'm especially interested in cross-modal perceptual groupings, and through various examples of my work, I will present different types of such groupings that I think underpin various emerging or trending audiovisual aesthetics. I will start with what I call a texture-based audiovisual cluster. In this example, there is no actual synchronization between sound and image. However, due to complexity of material and due to various similarities across both mediums, our mind starts to group arbitrary elements of sound and image together. In essence, our brains are trying to make sense of this audiovisual nonsense, and in doing so, they would go even so far to use one modality to modulate another one. The result is a very personal audiovisual structure based on numerous illusions, like the McGurk effect, for instance, but like the McGurk on steroids. In this case, we have similar situation as before, but with certain elements actually synchronized. I believe such approach amplifies the intermodal perceptual grouping and hence defines these cross-modal structures to a larger degree. And if we enforce audiovisual structures even further, we start to approach the territory of audiovisual objects. In next example, you will experience what I call visual objects dancing to the music. Pushing the enforcement of audiovisual structures even further, we would end up in the world of audiovisual objects based on static one-on-one mappings, a kind of audiovisual parallelism. I personally find such relationships especially useful for exploration of unconventional real-time instruments. Here is one example. In this example, I moved the particle tractor with the help of 3D motion sensor. So I was using my hand to control it, and the movement of particles was being sonified. Next example is an audiovisual object with dynamic relationships. In this case, we have a lot of audiovisual mappings going on, but pairs are constantly changing. Such objects appear to me as hyperobjects that offer various perspectives or realities of a single object. Another example is about extending visual part into space, which I think is a very interesting trend in contemporary new media production. This was an example of a spatial audiovisual object, and in the next example you will see a spatial audiovisual cluster. For the end, I'd like to say a few words about composition. I see audiovisual composition mainly as an art of how to move between these various types of audiovisual relationships over time. And my practice usually revolves around constraining and liberating sound and image from each other. And this drama I call the audiovisual escapology. That's it.
Sorry, I realised that I'd had it on before and that video was probably feeding through. Tade, do you want to add anything to that, or is that?
Well, not really. Maybe just that after seeing previous presentation and this one, I think I'm still under the impression that I was writing a PhD on this subject not a very long time ago, and yeah, I guess although it was meant to be a more informal presentation, I think I still got a bit too much into theory, but hopefully you found it interesting anyway.
Well, I think there are some things that we might feed into the discussion there. And yeah, the thing that I said when I was muted was just, yeah, really great work. I really enjoyed seeing all of that. So yeah, let's turn to Thor. Thor, hello. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for inviting me, Joe. And thanks everyone for these really interesting presentations. I think Seeing Sound has always been like a platform for these beautiful experiments with audiovisual work, thinking about music as something that goes beyond sound only, and embracing the visual and other things that maybe modern media have separated for us, really. So it's really our media history, if you think about it, that puts us into these boxes of sound, film, photography, theater, and so on. Most likely because of the expense of the equipment. Like, let's say in the earlier 20th century, you'd have film or art institutions, art colleges teaching film and sound in separate departments because the equipment was expensive and complicated. So students wouldn't so easily move between these two departments. Whereas today, of course, we're all sitting in front of laptops, and here we have the laboratory, the workshop to do any audiovisual work. And I think Seeing Sound is a good example of a festival that understands that the workshop of the contemporary composer or indeed visualist is both audio and visuals. So what we start to produce is audiovisual work. And we've seen fantastic examples of that here with my colleagues here on this panel. But yeah, I did look into this a little bit in my book. This is the book that Joe mentioned just earlier. It's called Sonic Writing. And in the book, I'm looking at how we have been defining sound through creating instruments and technologies. And I call that material inscriptions of sound. Also through symbolic inscription. So how we would use theories or symbolic systems to define musical sound with notation, audio, visual notation, animated notation, graphical notation, and so on. And then, of course, we have signal inscriptions, which is how we write sound into material directly in an analogous way, like with the wax cylinder, or now with digital audio, we're writing the signal down without the symbol. And I think it's interesting here to kind of look at sonic writing. I'm just going to connect it to my recent work and think about how we write down music or sound. And if we think about music from a bit of an archaeological perspective and try to find the genealogy of our media and how we represent sound, we of course see that music probably originates in our ancestors working together on some task, whether it's, you know, in a cave somewhere breaking nuts or doing some things in sync where you would use a tool of some sort, a rock or whatever. And if people are doing things together, it's very natural that they start to do it in sync. And when you start to do things in sync, that's music, obviously. They, of course, didn't call it music. They didn't see it as performance either, but it was a gesture and it was music, it was sound. And then this would, of course, we were becoming symbolic creatures as well. So dance and movement, so moving around with these kind of social forms that music is. You would also sit in the cave and watch the fire, because that was the light source in the evening. And the fire is visual, you know, beautiful visual, just like the work that you saw in with the lasers that Tajay was showing. You know, it's something that hypnotizes us, and it's beautiful to watch. So there we have a visual kind of element to all music from our history. And then, of course, musical instrumental performance is visual. You know, the way we play a guitar or a trombone or whatever, it's a visual thing. We see the relationship between the gesture and the use of the instrument, and then the sound. So it's really with sound recording that the visual is removed, you know. And how long is sound record? When was that invented? That was in the late 19th century and becoming popular around the 20s of, you know, 1920s. So we've really just had roughly 100 years of sound recording, where suddenly sound was put into a medium where there was no visual. And that's quite interesting, you know, what happened to music in that form. And it's only, I mean, then we see something like MTV happening in, when was it? In the
82.
80s. 82 was it? Yeah.
I think.
So that's really where music gets a medium for visuals again in popular culture. Of course, we have all these experiments of audiovisual music throughout the whole time. Video art, for example, coming much earlier than MTV. But I'm interested in this relationship between the visual and the sound, and I'm looking into that in my book a little bit, but also in my work. And I think I'll show a video of my Theranoscope live coding instrument at the end of this talk. I'm interested in the relationship between the visuals and the sound, and we can think here of the musical score as one way of describing that. And the first cases of the musical score were descriptive scores. People were describing what they heard, and they were kind of notating it, documenting it, in order to preserve it and share it and take it other places. So it was a description. And it was only much later that we start to prescribe for performers, to think about prescriptive scores, that these are the rules for someone to follow in order to create the sound. So we have descriptive scores describing what sound is through visual means, obviously, and prescriptive scores defining what we want to hear. And then notation is about this direct semantic relationship between sound and visual, of a one-to-one relationship most often. So I think it's interesting to see how audiovisual music comes into this space, sometimes as notation, but most often through visualization, which can be synchronized or sometimes totally disconnected, like the work Tadej was showing earlier here. So what I would like to then think about, or what you will see in the work that I will show is that I've created this Theranoscope, which is a live coding notation. So I'm notating with text, but it's visualizing what I write through a visual interface. But that visual becomes descriptive score of the sound, and can indeed become prescriptive notation for other performers who are performing with me. But that depends on how we define the performance and the roles, the role of the visual. I'd just like to put this as a point into our discussion, maybe that the role of notation in audiovisual music, whether it's descriptive notation, prescriptive notation, or if there is no notational element at all. So we're talking here about the semantic or semiotic relationship between sound and visuals, and I think that's an interesting field, an interesting thing to discuss in the media that we are working with. So maybe that would be my provocation and my input into the discussion later to think about that. But I talked about the Theranoscope, that I was live coding sounds, and those sounds were visualized, and they're visualized it's a drone instrument, and it has speakers as kind of crosshairs in the space. And then you will see drones that move around the space, and they move into the areas of the speakers, and you will see that they're on a scale from a concentric circle in the middle, and circles that go out. And that middle circle is the fundamental frequency of the harmonics of the space. So we're thinking about a harmonic space here. But in this instrument, I'm playing with microtonal tunings and microtonal music, and looking into kind of pitch relationships and so on. So that's just a short explanation of what we're going to see. So I think I'll ask Erin to maybe play the Theranoscope, maybe just for 1 or 2 minutes. That would be sufficient, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thor. That was great. As you know, I'm a big fan of the Threnoscope. We have featured Thor performing with it. I'm going to say twice. I think one time you did a workshop, actually, and one time you did a performance. But yeah, wonderful stuff. Let's move on to a bit of a discussion. I kind of suggested that we might do a panel discussion and then an open discussion. Because we've kind of gone over a bit, let's kind of blur the boundaries between those two. So let's start talking, but I will try and monitor the chats and the Q&A as well and feed in questions as they come. So anyone watching, do feel free to post anything. We probably won't get through it all, but we'll try. I do also have the YouTube stream up. I'll probably be less able to feed in things from there. Just one thing I noticed on the chat in particular is that the default seems to be to send questions just to panelists. I'd maybe change that, everyone, to all panelists and attendees, and then everybody can see what everybody's writing. Anyway, unless anyone else has got a starting point, I'd like to use what Thor just said as a good starting point. About notation, really. I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about in seeing sound territory. I guess for me, it's almost like a sort of teleological thing, an order of things, that notation tends to come first and then a performance will come out of notation. Whereas perhaps someone like Marcel, you might be taking a performance and making it visual in some way.
Yeah, I find that also a pretty interesting point, maybe starting point for discussion. This idea of visuals as a musical notation, or rather not.
Yeah.
And I would say I'm very strongly on the side of rather not.
Okay.
To me, the strongest connection between the whole visual elements like light, video, and also how the space feels is imaginary. It's what happens in people's imagination, in their heads. And people want to believe, people want to, like all of us, we want to see a connection. When we hear a sound and we see some visual input, we want to see a connection. And to me, a performance becomes particularly interesting when this connection is triggered, but not technically synced. I mean, I'm not saying like technical sync is really interesting. It produces its own kind of hypnotic works. But yeah, for my work, it's more this other side that I find really strong. And so when you mentioned Tadej's laser-based work with the noisy sound, I think there's a very strong connection. If these two elements come together, they trigger the right abstract subconscious thoughts. And it's really inspiring. And for someone like me, when I'm an audience member of this, it's really uplifting to feel that sense. And yes, in my work, I try to always tickle this.
Yeah. Sophia or Tadej, do you have anything to add to that? It's fine if you don't, by the way, don't feel pressure.
Maybe I could say that in a way, visuals can be always interpreted as some sort of notation. But in my case, for instance, I would say it's like a notation that kind of leaves you bewildered a bit or confused. You don't really know how to read it. You don't have instructions, so it's kind of more intuitive, kind of subconscious approach to that. Because I mean, I hear music very differently if I see visuals as well. And also, like I remember, for instance, for the first time when I really started thinking about it, it was many years ago, about 20 years ago, when I was watching John Zorn's Masada, and they played some, it was like, I think like 10-member band, and they played some very, very noisy stuff, and I could really mix my music by paying attention to different performers, because it was so complex that you couldn't hear or perceive everything, like all the details. So I felt like I'm mixing music by just visually looking at different gestures that these musicians are doing, and I think that's a lot also what I do in my work, but with these abstract visuals. So in a way, you can like to completely consciously change music with visuals. You can just bend the meaning, or there's really a lot of things you can do. So in a way, it is some sort of annotation, but it depends how you really look at it from what angle.
Cool. Sophia, I'm going to turn to you in one moment, but first I just wanted to feed something in that Barry Moon has posted on the chat. I don't think it really needs an answer. It's not a question, but Barry has pointed out that the score coming first isn't necessary in animated scores. And that's a very good point. I mean, thinking about what you do with the Threnoscopes, Thor, that can also be done live. So I guess, yeah, my idea that it came first is an old-fashioned idea with a printed score. And if it's more interactive than that, that can be blurred. But yeah, I'm moving on from there. I just wanted to turn to you, Sophia, and see if you had anything to answer to that. And if you like, I'd quite like to move the discussion on maybe to sonic fiction and the way you use writing in your work, which I guess it isn't notation or is something different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, my book came out of the record, really. I sort of sat in the sound worlds and in different environments in Iceland, in Scotland, and started writing what I was seeing through the sound. And eventually, kind of through lots of processes, it became poetry. But poetry that's kind of linked to a lot of, I don't know, I guess kind of theories around sort of ecologies, future ecologies, being connected to everything. So that kind of world, really. And I've never written poetry before, so for me this whole process was really quite peculiar. I wouldn't have called myself a writer in any way, I never really used to enjoy writing, but I found that this was a really different way of writing about sound, which then kind of fed into more of a visual image that grew into an AV show. So it kind of came in between the sound and the visuals that that the show is going to, well, is. So not really talked about it much before as yet.
Yeah.
It's a little bit tied in with my PhD, so I'm just starting to kind of write about it now as a process. But there's this kind of writing up it kind of allows you to be very atmospheric rather than, I guess, intellectualizing something or kind of trying to make a theory out of it. Theories start to kind of emerge just through this much more free, creative writing. And I guess in some ways I drew the idea from Koji Ueshin's More Brilliant Than the Sun, and the way that he talks about, which was then very new, but jungle and all of that electronic music that happens in the late 80s, early 90s. And the words to sort of in themselves bring sound to life rather than kind of talking about it from quite a separate place, not sort of within it. I'm rambling.
No, not at all. That's very interesting. And it was interesting for me that you said you don't do much writing, because I know you've done quite a lot of theoretical writing through your PhD and so on. But I guess you're separating those two maybe. But I wonder if those separations are also blurring a bit. And I'm slightly turning back to Thor again, that through this whole sonic fiction thing, which I guess does date back to that Eschun book, that maybe there's a sort of blurring between the work and the writing about the work, and maybe around this whole kind of notation thing as well.
Yeah, I think everything is blurring these days. I mean, the distinction between a work and an instrument, for example. What is an instrument and what is a work? Do you compose something like software or something that is bespoke for a particular piece? Or does that become something that you use as an instrument and maybe hand over to other people to play with? And where is the relationship between you and the audience or other performers? If other people are using your software to perform that particular piece, are they playing your piece or their piece? So all these areas are distinctions are blurring, I think. And that's the beauty of 21st century musical practice, I think, that the language that we have developed in the 19th and 20th century about musical practices, it's completely disintegrating, and we probably have to come up with lots of new words, but it doesn't look like we're very successful as to yet. But hopefully we, discussions like these and the work that people are doing will contribute to that kind of new language for new practices.
Yeah. I'd like to turn back to you, Sophia, and because I know that in some of your work, certainly with your PhD, I think you've also addressed kind of site and location and psychogeography. We've had this a very, very long, I have to say, question in from Amy Cutler, who's got some work in the exhibition, a very interesting artist who works a lot with location. And Amy, I'm afraid I'm going to paraphrase this horribly, but her work really engages a lot with geography. And well, perhaps you can all read the question. It comes in two parts, but touching on sort of romanticism and the sublime, and ideas of being an explorer, perhaps. I did find this quite interesting, actually, when we were, both Marcel and Sophia were using Iceland as a location, essentially, for their work, where Thor is, just living there. It's quite an interesting disconnect, perhaps, and something that, and also Marcel, with your recent work in Murmansk, wasn't it? That you said you'd really moved away from abstraction and actually using a portrait of that place. And it's a bit vague, but I think there's something quite interesting in here about, perhaps, especially now, we use other places in our work as a medium, as something visual or I suppose sonic.
Yeah,
Layered, not all from the same place, not all from the same time. I think that was super important to me, that I visited lots of different locations and got quite a lot of different type of footage. And the same with the writing, it needed to be of different times, of different places, so it didn't all kind of focus on one location. Because I think exploring things like, post-anthropocentric ecologies, you're dealing with subjects that are on, geological timescales, and not ones that you can experience as a person in one place and one time. So I guess for me, sonically and visually, those things were quite important, really, that everything was kind of brought together from lots of different places and times. So, the sound worlds, they weren't created from field recordings of one location. So it wasn't so much about being there and in one place, but more kind of trying to explore these material properties over lots of different locations.
Yeah, indeed. I also picked Iceland as a location because it fits so well to the work, or to the ideas of the work. It is, in that sense, it is a medium, and it has a certain purity and a coherence in itself, which makes it so fascinating. And in a way, I envy you, Thor, for living there, because yes, it has this power that it opens something in the soul where you say, like, you're like, it absorbs you. And for this piece that I did, it was about the extremes of perception. There was the importance of something that seems infinite, like pure and perfect, but also infinite. And that was the main reason to film in Iceland for me, because most of the world here is like overgrown or ruined by humans. So there is no more eternity to see in the landscapes here. So yeah, Iceland was perfectly and poetically representing that.
I've never been, and I really want to. Anyway, Amy, I'm sorry I said that was really long. It's really long and really interesting, and I do suggest everyone read what Amy wrote there. There's a lot to think about. But I'm going to move it on because we've got a few more things coming in on the chat. There was something from Brett Batty. Hello, Brett. Well, it's really for Tadej, but for everybody, and I'll just read it out. Tadej, you spoke a striking phrase at the end of your film, something like sound and image constraining and releasing each other. What was that, so I can quote you? And could we say a bit more about what it means to you? It seems a powerful idea of relating complex sound and image, gestures, stroke textures.
Okay, so the main idea has I call audiovisual escapology, and I've written about that in my PhD thesis. So it's all there if anyone wants to know more details. But essentially, it's kind of my approach to audiovisual composition. So escapology, for those who don't know, it's about liberating from constraints, like Houdini was in The Master, who, they put him in a cage or chained him up, and then he needed to kind of escape. And that's usually what I'm doing with sound and image. So usually, I compose a lot with tension and release, and I found music has more power when it comes to tensions, and usually I would then really sync the two mediums together to emphasize this tension with image. And sometimes, I get a bit annoyed if sound and image are synced for a too long time. It's a bit like, oh, come on, go away. And I would maybe persist for a while in these relationships to just kind of emphasize the tension even more in this kind of cross-modal sense. And then at some point, I would kind of release this energy, maybe at some kind of orgasmic kind of peak, liberating sound and image going different ways. Or maybe I would just kind of dissolve this energy slowly. There are kind of various trajectories how I would kind of play with this kind of entrapment and liberation. And that's kind of my approach to composition.
Yeah, fantastic. Solveig, if I'm pronouncing that right, and I'm probably not, right at the beginning of the session, asked if I could say a bit more about what Seeing Sound was about in its broadest sense. And that's quite a good answer, actually, just to that. I kind of think Seeing Sound is not really about music, and it's not really about visual art. It's about whatever relationships happen between them. And that's a really nice take on that today. I really like it. I'm sure I'll be quoting that as well. I'm going to move on to a question from Maura McDonnell, and this is from Marcel. I'm fascinated as how you use various types of light, from haze to sharp, icy-like architectures. What do you think connects between such different types of light and similar equivalent sounds? That's an interesting idea.
That's a good question. It's definitely a good question. I mean, ultimately, to me, it's always feeling based. You always it needs to feel right. And I know this is a very vague answer, but whatever technique I use or whatever combination, it somehow needs to feel right, and it needs to be almost less as if in a dance with the sound. It needs to, yeah, it needs to go well, and maybe that's also a good topic that's being opened here. What I feel like we are missing out a little bit is the space, how the space feels. I feel like this is also very important to the idea of like seeing sound, or how we experience this whole ceremony that we are in. That the space influences it so much. Is it open? Is it narrow? Is it like compressed and weighing heavy on you? Or is it like a very grand space where all these beams can come into fruition, where they can really shape out something? And how is the audience, how are we as audience members, if we think from this perspective, how are we placed in it? How does it feel to us? Do we feel like an intense group? Is it like a procession that we are part of? Or does it rather feel like very individualist? Does it feel more like a narrow dance floor, sweaty and whatnot? Or is it more seated and like you're intellectually leaning back? All these aspects, I think, come in a lot to foster this experience that you're having. And it's one of the themes, if we're looking to the future a bit, that I would like to also work on more in future presentations. To work with atmosphere, to work with space as far as you can, and work with how the audience is coming into fruition. For example, I saw a very, very good piece in at Mona Festival in Australia last year or the year before, where everyone was on yoga mats. So they had this great circle of yoga mats, and there was like, I don't know, 200 people on yoga mats, almost like worshiping or physically experiencing the performer. And that changes a lot how the whole performance feels. And to me, yeah, this should be more considered as part of the practice of taking sound out of the speakers and out of the instruments into something that we feel and experience.
I do absolutely agree with you, Marcel. I think it's really, really important part of what we do, and something that I see really developing in interesting ways as well, both in sort of physical space and maybe virtual space, perhaps at the moment. We do have a panel on that. That's tomorrow afternoon's panel specifically. Right. And I should say, I really dithered as to which panel to put you on, Marcel. You could have easily been on that panel as well, and you would have a lot to say about that. I'm just going to move on.
Sorry that I didn't really answer the question.
No, not at all.
It's like, I can only say feeling based. That's like learning over a long time, learning all the tools and then combining them based on what feels right.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'd put in, which is also a bit weak, but maybe I just slip it in there. Looking at the work you do with Ben Frost, for instance, the Aurora thing, I do really see or feel a relationship between the light and the haze and the music. The music, and this is why it's a bit weak, I've got to kind of do this, but that music is kind of foggy in a way. It's kind of got these big distorted, if I imagine it, it's a great big sort of fuzzy thing, and your light seems to fit that in a way that something much more kind of delicate and screen based wouldn't. It sort of needs to be big and like I say, sort of fuzzy around the edges somehow. And actually a lot of the music that people make on this panel is slightly within sort of, I don't know if it's drone, but kind of big extended sort of sound palette territory. And I wonder if that goes with the sort of visuals that we're making. If no one's got a quick response to that, I'm going to move on because that's just me waffling. Really.
I could just add something that I started thinking, listening to Marcel, but it's it's these spaces and it's this opening up for interpretation that he's talking about, and what is that then? Subjective experiences of sound and visuals, and focusing into different areas of the music. Tadej was talking about John Zorn and focusing into areas of that, which is of course an interpretive act. And I think you asked about the kind of drony type of music. I think that kind of lends itself to opening up for the audience to focus on different parts of things, because if you have really rhythmic or kind of exciting music, you are attracting the focus of the audience all the time. You're kind of focusing in on something, whereas with more open spaces, less adventurous music or adventful music, you open up the space for interpretation. And for example, I have sometimes performed my drone instrument, which was a bit, with carpets and pillows on the floor and so on. And people have fallen asleep during the performance. And I think that's really wonderful because, of course, it shows that people are feeling safe in the space, but then they fall asleep and they have dreams, So dreams are, of course, a visual accompaniment to the music there. And that's really a subjective experience of generating visuals as well. So I think there's a lot of interesting areas here with this kind of open spaces where the audience can come in and be, partly or fully creative in their experiences.
Yeah, you touched on something really interesting there, Thor. When you were talking about the end of that night at Atonal, Marcel, you talked about your use of strobes and asking the audience to close their eyes. That really put me in mind of Brian Geisen's Dream Machine. I don't know if you know this piece that you're supposed to watch with your eyes closed and was supposed to make you dream. And yeah, I mean, this could be a huge topic of conversation, but that kind of, I wonder if audiovisual work allows you to tap into kind of subconscious areas in a way that we might not otherwise.
I think so. I think it has these hypnotic qualities that trigger something that is very deep. That is, it's not in the realm of intellect. It's nothing that we consciously think about and put into perspectives, put into registers. It's really something like music, maybe the truest form of meeting music, where it triggers something very subconscious, very deep, rooted in us.
Yeah.
I very much like this. I very much like this. And I also like the idea, what you said, like that you, but I thought what you said about performing sitting on pillows and that people might even fall asleep. It's a very beautiful idea also, like transcending sound, or like turning sound into a true experience. I really like and appreciate that.
Yeah. Fred Colopy in the chat has brought up Max Richter's Sleep there, which I haven't actually seen yet, so I won't comment on, but I'm sure is very relevant and is 100% on my list of things to get to. There's a couple of questions I've been neglecting. Zoom webinar annoyingly seems to have two different places to ask questions, and I haven't been looking at the Q&A. So we have an anonymous question that came in really a long time ago, but hopefully is still relevant. I guess it might be to you, Thor, particularly. Do you think that AI could help provide the composer with alternate notation and improvisation skills? Seems like two separate things, but there's something in there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question, and the basic answer would just be AI can help with everything.
Yeah.
But whether you want to do it and how you want to do it and so on is another issue, I guess. But yeah, I think there's so much to explore here, and the AI is, of course, just an instrument. It's an extension of our tools, of our thinking. It's not going to replace our creativity. It's just an instrument in our toolbox, or a tool in our toolbox. So definitely it can help. And I think my colleagues in the Mimic project are going to be presenting, for example, AI in audiovisual work in the paper session just after this session. So more on that there, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the first paper this afternoon for everybody. And yeah, another question that came up on the Q&A from Solveig. How does synesthetes react to seeing audiovisual works like yours? Can there be possible conflicts, discrepancies between their internal association between the sound and visuals and the concrete association imposed by the artist? Quite an interesting take on that question, actually. Has anyone experienced that? Has anyone on this panel had somebody sort of come up to them after a performance saying, I'm a synesthete, you know, your work either kind of supported or conflicted with my...
Actually, quite often.
Right.
Quite often, both with artists as well as with audience members. Mostly when working for Atonal or The Long Now. Maybe that answers the question before, or the point before, when we talked about briefly about Max Richter's sleepover concerts. We do an event which was in the same scope in the same festival called The Long Now, which goes for 32 hours non-stop. But it's not dance music. It's not, well, I was about to say not a druggy experience, but of course people are free to do what they want. We have these 32 hours of ambient or experimental music that goes on and on and on. There's beds in the space and you can sleep through it. You can just dream away. And it's a beautiful place of introspection. So this is a very interesting way of, or like a very, very beautiful and nice way of perceiving music as well. Because if you're there for 32 hours, you're in a different mode than if you go to one show or one concert. This rush, this idea of like, need to see this, need to see that, is completely disappears. It's like you might have some conversations with your friends, the conversations die down and it feels natural. It feels completely natural. You dream or you think, and et cetera, I'm rambling. And especially in the scope of The Long Now, I had often conversations with people about synesthesia and also with artists. And yeah, funny enough, I always wonder if synesthesia, if this connection between a certain sound and a certain color, if this is the same for all of us, or it's a different color to a different sound for all of us. Because I had specifically one artist Chinese artist, and they were performing a music where I felt very strong. This is blue to me. Blue should be the dominant color, and there should be a lot of lighting flashes. So all the lighting flashes, animation, fine, we agreed, but they wanted red.
Mm-hmm.
And like this was really jarring for me, because usually I'm much more often used to the opposite, that people say like, oh yeah, this works so nicely, this is exactly what I was thinking about, etc., etc. But yes, sometimes it happens that synesthesia goes exactly the opposite way.
Yeah.
But in general, I'd say it's a very important thing, because a strong work has this inbuilt, if you're aware of it or not. So,
yeah. I mean, it's a huge theme that tends to come up with Seeing Sound. And I should say we've got, he has just posted, I think, Fred Colopy, who is in the chat, is a bit of an expert on this. Don't know if any of you've seen, there's a diagram that often gets reproduced in books of many different versions of color scales that have been used through sort of 300 years of visual music history. And there is surprisingly little similarity between them. You can read patterns into it or not, like lots of these things. A couple of questions that come up that are a bit related, I think. So Ross Davidson, to all panelists, I really loved the way that the visuals of Sophia's work were like a visual equivalent to acousmatic music in the way that it engaged with and processed the source material. I'd be interested to hear about the panelists' approach to referentiality in their work. Is it a different practice to work with such materials and their interrelationships, or is their approach not at all not different to approaches of less representative visuals? Did you get that? I kind of stumbled over a bit in the middle. But I think, to paraphrase this idea of kind of using referential real world materials versus kind of more abstract.
I mean, for mine in particular, I was trying to create these kind of futuristic alien-like environments that, are kind of possible future environments. So it was quite important that I used something that had that familiarity, so real footage, and had the flows and movements of the world that we know, but also had something other.
Yeah.
Something, I don't know. I guess some of it is, obviously digitally processed. So I guess in some ways, and also in the differences between the light. In some parts, the light emits from within the planet, from within the Earth, rather than from outside of it. I don't know if I'm even answering this question.
Well, it's a big question, actually. For sure.
It is a big question. It's a big question. I think it it depends on what you're trying to explore as an idea set. So
I think it does. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I thought was interesting from that question was the idea of extending ideas of acousmatic music. For anyone who's not familiar with that term, it goes back to Pierre Schaeffer and essentially just means sound from loudspeakers, but sound that's been abstracted in some way where it's been removed from its source. Now, I think maybe one thing did you want to disagree with that, Dede, or?
No, I just wanted to add something, like, for instance, like in Sin Species project, where I did the visuals and my friend Elias Merino did the music. I used one kind of 3D scan of a physical object. And then the whole show is basically about deformations of this one and the same object. So I think, and I guess if you don't know this, it's impossible to recognize it because it's so modified. But in a way, it has some link to referential world, but it's really taken out and abstractized to like a large degree. And then I guess the link between the real world is really more the forces, the deformations, rather than kind of objects with some semantic meaning. Yeah.
It seems to sort of take us back into this sonic fiction territory as well. I just wanted to put one thing, I'm going to write him in the chat here, there's a Seeing Sound regular, I don't think is here this year, called Diego Garro, who's written quite a lot about sort of acousmatic thinking applied to audiovisual work. Anyone who's interested in that might want to Google him. He's written some quite interesting articles about that, including a chapter in the recent Sound Image book coming out of Greenwich University. A question from Sophia, which I think might be a good place to finish because we need to start thinking about finishing. What's the future of performing your works? Have you thought of new ways in these uncertain times? Big question, which I'm sure you are all thinking about. I don't know if you've got any answers though.
It's very important that it's loud and there's a massive sound system. So for me, it's that kind of physical bodily experience of masses of bass and the physicality of sound in a big space, big sound and big space, big images. So I don't know. I think it's really quite tricky because anything where you're making it, you know, not in that environment and it hasn't got that kind of physical feeling, that interaction, that being there in a space and experiencing that, I think is quite unusual. I don't know if I don't want to think of a future where the physical force of the sound, you know, isn't present. And
I completely understand that.
like you know, it's
maybe particularly with your work, but with all of our work, really, you know.
Well, Ben Frost, you know, Ben Frost's all about that, really, isn't? You know, it's incredibly loud performances, incredibly loud, and that feeling of just being completely taken by the sound and the images is really important to how you.
Yeah, absolutely, and I guess the same thing applies, perhaps particularly Tadej and Marcel, to your visual worlds as well, that they really kind of rely a lot on space and on big space. You know, let's be, you know, it's a simplistic thing, but it's a real thing that we're talking about: loud sound and big spaces and tiny little boxes on tiny screens. I mean, is there anything we can do to replicate that? I don't think there probably is there? But
Sometimes.
I don't have any idea.
Some people might suggest virtual reality here, but I agree with Sophia. It's also about the space and the sound system. You're never going to have that in virtual reality, that unique experience. But not just that, but also the social experience of going with your friends, having drinks, you know, and all that, to go places and experience the new architecture, new places, new towns or parts of towns. But I must say, though, I mean, COVID has taught us a lot. Like, we're here now doing this, and people all over the world might be watching this. A year ago, you might have organized a conference in Bath or a festival in Bath, and only parts, you know, very lucky people would attend that conference. So now we're here maybe with attendees from all over the world, and that's beautiful. And the same happened for a workshop we did this summer. We were going to have a workshop with 16 people in Brighton, and because of COVID, we suddenly went online, and we had 200 people from all over the world. Yeah, so that's beautiful. And I must say, I watched a few pieces from the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival this year on my TV, and that was quite good. It wasn't what Sophia was describing, you know, but it was nice to still be able to see what some of these beautiful pieces.
Yeah, but maybe the strength of that experience comes because you know how it feels in the space, and your mind builds the bit that's missing. Yeah, I wonder how that is for younger generation.
I mean, that seems like a really nice place to sort of start to wrap up, really, that I think sadness, you know, that we can't be in big spaces with big visuals and loud noises right now. There's no way around that. Hope that we will be able to again. I really hope we will be able to at some point next year. I think it's not unrealistic to start to think those might open up again. But yeah, this idea that Thor said of learning from this year as well, and maybe wrapping some of that in as well. I think there could be some really interesting possibilities that open up out of that. I mean, you know, one thing that I expect to happen next year, I think, is maybe lots of outdoor events. You know, maybe we can start to gather, but a bit further apart and in big outdoor spaces, and we can still have big visuals and loud sounds, you know. But yeah, we do all miss them. And I mean, the only thing that occurred to me actually is thinking about gamers and their kind of vibrating chairs and things. Actually, there was something else that occurred. I knew I wanted to put this in. I don't know if Pablo Villerias is watching, one of our Bath Spa AV people, but he runs a night called Midnight Ritual, a club night. And he took that online very early in lockdown, just on Zoom. And I was really interested to see how that evolved. He ran it every week for, you know, a couple of months probably. And the audience really kind of ran with it. And what was really interesting to see week on week is people started to basically set up their own little clubs. So you'd see people with like quite good lighting, and they'd obviously have the sound on big speakers. And, you know, they were trying to replicate that in their rooms. And it's not the same, of course, but, you know.
It's also the economy of it. You know, if as a musician, most of what you make now, because you don't make money really out of releases, is from, you know, going and performing. So I think while there's all the artistic side to think about, there's also just the nuts and bolts of how many people are actually not really able to, or having to retrain, having to think differently about what they're going to do to try to make money. And yeah, that's you know, that's pretty harsh, really, when you think about it.
And there's no way around that.
I feel like I'm the voice of doom and gloom. I'm sorry.
Well, that's fine, Sophia. We need some doom and gloom. And I mean, you know, like I say, I think both things are true, really. You know, there's no point in pretending that everything's just fine. But I also think there are some rays of hope, as I said at the beginning. And I genuinely think that.
There are sub packs, by the way. So the thing you were talking about that gamers have, musicians use them in the studio as well. If you're in a space where you have to be quiet, it's called a sub pack, and it vibrates with bass from sound. And they're not too expensive, I don't think. So,
all right, I might have to get
those
one.
sorts of events, yeah, you probably could use something like that.
Owen Fender, hi. Owen is saying we need a government PA and disco lighting fund. Yeah, so we'll support that. You heard it here first.
But no disco lighting can replace all the people.
No, well, that, I mean, that's of course is the big thing, the people.
That's for me, that's the biggest takeaway from this whole pandemic and shutdown is what I'm really missing is the ceremonial aspect of it.
Yeah.
Everything else can be somehow replicated, and VR is great, it's an experience of its own, but it doesn't have that. And I guess there's a reason why this happens since the beginning of humankind. That people come
absolutely.
Together and they celebrate. There is something.
Yeah, I mean, we have to acknowledge that, you know, music and AV isn't just about music and AV, is it? It's about that ceremony and everything around it, the ceremony of going out. And I have to say, Marcel, that we probably all have our kind of golden memories of something we did pre-lockdown. And yeah, Atonal last year was one of those for me. Really did have that sense of ceremony. You know, I don't live in Berlin, so it's just exciting for me to go to Kraftwerk and yeah, experience that. And yeah, I look forward to doing it again. And Barry Moon has ended with fuck COVID. That's fair enough. That's
Amen.
Hello, Barry.
You know each other, don't you, Sophia and Barry?
Barry taught me at undergraduate level Max MSP.
All right, well, look, it's exactly 14:30, so I'm going to stop it there. The next thing that's happening are the papers, which are on YouTube, presentations starting at 2:45 or 14:45 GMT. Thank you so much to this panel. That was a really great discussion. I really enjoyed it. And to everyone who chipped in on the chat. I'm sorry we didn't probably quite get to everything, but we got to most things. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for everyone for watching.
Cheers.
Thank you.